What's up, everyone? Today I'm going to make a Zelkova forest in this kind of medium-sized tray. Well, I've already got the screen in here, and the next thing that I want to do is basically to add a bunch of tie wires. And if there's ever a time where you need a lot of tie wires, it's when you're initially building a forest, because in many cases the trees they'll be coming from different pots or different flats, and they don't have roots holding them together. So we're going to use a couple of different techniques to both anchor the trees relative to each other and to anchor them in the pot. And as opposed to if I was just tying a regular bonsai in here, I'm actually going to add a bunch of tie wires. And I can always, once I've added a certain number of tie wires, I can then kind of play off those tie wires in terms of adding additional segments of wire if I need them. So I'm just going to go ahead and go from a couple different holes, giving myself some different options, still using like a standard tie wire technique, going from one hole to another. All right, so I don't really know if I'm going to need this many, but better to have them in there before I start adding soil than have to add more later. So I've gone from here to here, here to here, and then from each one of these holes to the center. And that means with 6 tie wires that I have 12 ends. You know, the more trees, if I were just putting like 2 or 3 trees in here, then maybe I would only need a couple of tie wires. But with a lot of trees, as I'm planning to make this kind of I guess you could call it a distant view forest, I'll need to be able to tie a lot of trees into place, and this will give me the foundation for being able to do that. Now that I've got the tie wires in place, I can set this aside and start looking at preparing the trees that I'm going to use to create the forest. So we grow these trees in clumps, basically in seedling flats. We use Anderson propagation flat. It's a 17-inch mesh bottom container that comes from a company in Oregon named Anderson Tool and Die. And basically, we use these to just sow seeds in the greenhouse so that the roots don't run too much as they would in a solid bottom container. And then after a year or 2 years, 3 years, depending on the flat, I tend to pull them apart. And the interesting thing that happens in that amount of time is that with a little bit of judicious cutback on these guys, in terms of the tops, you can see that they're not just like a straight no branch kind of thing, that they've almost started to create their own little clumps of forests by themselves. And in fact, there's been a few times where I just took a flat and essentially transplanted it with a little bit of manipulation straight into a bonsai pot. So the roots on this particular clump of 5 trees, two pretty small ones. This one's not looking like 2 pretty small ones and 3 larger ones. These are all kind of meshed together, so I'm going to leave those together as a clump, and that'll make it easier to anchor them. But in order to leave them as a clump, I've already trimmed some large roots off the bottom here. I'll set that aside. Got another nice big tree here, and we're in a forest composition. I'm not usually too concerned about the nebari, the display of nebari on any given tree. So even though I'm trying to create compact root balls with these guys, I'm not really meticulously creating high quality roots like you would want to see in a broom-style tree. Now, when you're creating forests, it's really important to have a variety of sizes of tree, and we're currently selling bare-root Zelkova, and when you buy a clump from us, we tend to send you a couple of larger trees like these guys. The size, the overall size varies depending on the flats that they're coming out of. but then also some little teeny ones, and these guys which are on the small side but not tiny. So here's one that's been pulled out of the flat that maybe wasn't trimmed quite enough. I'll trim off the bottom roots here, and then I'm gonna leave it really tall, just in case I want a tall tree. Here's another clump that I pulled straight out of a flat, and what I'm kind of looking at when I look at these in terms of whether or not I'm eliminating any of the branching or cutting it back shorter or anything like that is just kind of how they work together. And I find that when they're grown together in flats like this as young trees, they kind of create their own relationship, which has kind of a value in terms of creating a natural scene. So one thing is that the spacing between the trees is sort of irregular because it's just determined by broadcasting seed onto the surface of a flat and then covering it with soil. So that gives you a really natural sort of spacing, and if you can maintain that, it's good for not allowing straight lines, not allowing things to look like they were artificially created, which is something that the logical part of your brain has a habit of doing. So I'm just going to trim back some of the long shoots, especially ones that are smaller, in preparation, so that I can more easily judge as I'm putting these together what the possibilities are in terms of the overall forest. Here's a nice clump that is mostly smaller trees, and these kinds of clumps are really good for creating more depth and breadth in the composition. And one thing to keep in mind is generally that, in my view of a forest, that the trees that are in the middle of the forest won't have very many low branches. They might have a few, but it's not going to be like a dense bramble. Well, unless it was a forest that had brambles in it, but that's different. But the trees that are on the outside of the forest, in my view, are kind of like, they're going to have the habit of like leaning towards light. And if you take that as a kind of universal rule that trees are always seeking out the available light that's nearby, then you're going to see that when you put them in clumps, that they naturally have this tendency to spread outward. The trees that are on the outside of the clump and the ones that are in the middle, on the inside of the clump, have a tendency to be larger and taller because they're reaching straight up, because the trees around them are preventing them from being able to go one direction or another, and also from being able to just sort of evenly spread out into what you would think of as a broom-style, which depicts a tree that is growing more in an open ground situation as opposed to in competition with a lot of other trees. All right, so that's everything that was in my bucket, and these are definitely going to be the biggest trees that are in the composition. I might go ahead and add smaller ones, but in order to figure that out, I first need to get the pot up here and decide which trees are going to be the anchor trees for the composition. So this is the largest trunk that I have, and that makes it a natural candidate to be the anchor tree, like the main tree in the forest. But it has a couple of problems that make it maybe not quite as suitable. One is that it has more low branching down here than I would expect to see on a tree that's growing in the middle of the forest, the largest tree in a forest. And it's also not as tall as some of my other trees that are actually skinnier. So I have to decide, do I want a tree like this that is sort of basically a standout in terms of girth, but not as tall as these? Now, one way that I could do that is to make a taller clump that's more dense on one side and maybe like a shorter clump that has fewer trees on the other. There's almost an infinite number of possibilities. And so I find that the the best thing, to get me started is to kind of have a clump or a individual tree that sort of inspires you in terms of creating your forest. So I'm going to keep looking through these. I like this one. Now, one thing that I haven't mentioned yet is that I can change the height of the smaller trees just by cutting them back further. So I could cut this one back further because this is now the largest tree here. And it's also shorter than this one. The other thing is that keep in mind that you're going to be growing this out for a number of years, and over time you can have this one kind of take over while keeping this one shorter. But it would make sense for the main cut, I have a cut here, to be lower on a tree that's towards the outside. So you start building the crown and the ramification lower down on the tree. So I think this is a better main tree, and so I'm going to set this one aside and maybe use it for something else. Now, even when you're working with clumps, you should be rotating the clumps to kind of determine what gives you better depth, what positions your main tree versus your secondary trees better. So for example, if I put this like this, that kind of makes this the primary tree. It's both taller, but it's smaller than this one. So I actually want to create the illusion that this is my main tree. So let me try putting this guy over here, and now I have small trees in front, but most of these trees right here are kind of lining up with each other. So if I rotate it this way, now I see more of those trees. I also don't want the tree to be right in the center, so I can see my wires coming out right here in the center. So I'm going to go ahead and leave that there. That's actually looking pretty nice. Now if I come back over here, I could use this as my smaller half of the forest. Of course, I'm looking at the relationship of the size of the trunks as well as the spacing of the trees and all that kind of stuff. But like I said before, I can shorten some of these at this stage to make the largest tree the tallest and the sort of skinnier trees. It doesn't have to be universally true, but when you're talking about the 1, 2, 3 largest trees in the composition, you should make sure that that hierarchy is in place. And then taking this a step further, I can sort of use some of these other clumps. Now, the good thing about clumps is that these guys are already kind of close together, so I can leave larger spaces between these clumps that I had preformed from the flat in order to create more diversity. If you have a space straight through your forest, you have more of a feeling of like infinite depth, but at the same time it can feel like you can create kind of a more comforting, almost like a little hollow in the forest that's quite nice by putting trees behind your main trees like this. Now I can kind of adjust all these guys, and I'm just sort of roughly placing these. And that kind of catches your eye and fills in the forest. And then I could use a clump of smaller trees over here. As well as some of these individuals. Now this one's great for the side of the forest. See how it's very directional? So it's probably created based on the position that it was growing in the flat. It was probably near the edge of the flat. So if I put that over here, it really already has that kind of movement, like it belongs either here or here. I think I'm liking this, so before I go too much further, I'm going to pull all these back out and add some soil on the bottom. All right, with a little bit of soil in there, I'm going to start by anchoring this main clump. And because it's already a clump, it's easier to anchor. But if you have just bare root and you haven't created a clump like this before, what you can do is you can use wire to wrap from one trunk to another in order to stabilize the clump if the roots are not doing it naturally. So I'll demonstrate that here in just a second. All right, I mean, it's not permanent, but knowing that your positioning here is semi-permanent, each time you place something, make sure that the rotation, angles, the angles of the trees are as close to final as they can be, because it gets harder and harder as the trees mature together to change those angles. I've also added just a slight mound in the middle. That helps the center trees be a little bit taller, and gives it sort of a natural kind of growing on a grassy, like a slight hill in the middle of a giant field or something like that. Now, in this case, this tree is a little bit lower than I want it to be, so I'm going to add some additional soil before I tie it in, just to bring the kind of roots up to be roughly in line with the roots from the trees around it. And now I'm going to take these and kind of try to tweak them a little bit before I go too far. This trunk right here is wanting to lean that way too much, so I'm going to see if I can kind of move the roots a little bit, and that one's not solidly tied. All right, so since this one is giving me problems, I'm going to go ahead and use that technique that I just described. Basically, I'm going to almost treat it like it's two branches of the same tree, and then I'm wiring them. Now, the great thing about this is that this is going to allow me to stabilize this tree. The bad thing about this is that if I'm not careful, once this thing leafs out, it is going to be very difficult to see anything down in here. And so I need to keep an eye on this wire, because I definitely don't want it to scar the bark on a Zelkova. They're very unforgiving of scarring. Okay, so that's stabilized that a little bit, and I'm going to kind of leave these tails of this wire on here to remind me, kind of like a little flag. So that gives me two good clumps with some nice depth, and I'm pretty happy with it, but I'm not done. I want this to be a pretty full looking forest, and so I'm going to put that clump back here in order to create some more depth. But I moved, if you look at it from the side, I moved this clump forward a little bit to leave a lot of space here, because I want to kind of create a little bit of negative space here in the middle. I don't just want to fill in this entire space. And I think that's going to mean that I actually need to take off some more soil from this clump so that I can kind of scoot it back closer to the back of the pot. Now that I've got that kind of positioned in there, let's take a look and see what it looks like from the front. So it's adding some nice depth to this side, but there's almost like it's like a path that meanders around that big tree, but there's a little bit more negative space than I want right there. So I'm going to scoot this over a little bit, give a little bit more emphasis to this tree right here. Now, if you notice, all the trees in that group in the back are relatively small. That is almost like forced perspective. By making the trees that are in the back smaller, you make it look like they're further away. And that's not really what I'm going for, but it's not a bad thing to play with a little bit, especially if you like that type of illusion in your forests. So looking at this now, I like this side. We've got this tree creating some nice space. We've got these three little trees here creating some nice space. I can make this one lean out a little bit over time. We've got little trees here in front of the secondary tree, which is this one. And then a nice clump here, but this is looking a little bit more sparse. There's not necessarily anything wrong with creating some sparse areas in a planting like this, but I think it's going to look a little bit better if I add a few more trees on this side. That adds some nice depth. All right, with this clump of 4 covered in wire, I can position it without the roots already being knitted together, but I'm paying attention to how it relates to the rest of the trees here in this composition. All right, I think that looks pretty good. So with all of the trees placed, I'm going to go ahead and add some more soil and chop it in the spaces between the clumps. rather than cover this in live moss, I've shredded some live moss and mixed it with some shredded sphagnum, and I'm going to use that to cover the surface, which will kind of hasten the creation of like a natural moss covering. And since I don't have enough moss around, this is the best solution for me to retain a little bit more moisture near the top, near the upper roots on these trees that I just planted. Right. With the surface covered, I'm going to go through and do a little bit of branch editing and adjustment of the bits that are too tall or too long and just crossing. So in a forest composition like this, we don't want a lot of crossing bits. All right, and from here, it seems like the obvious problem left is this tree, which is just too tall. So I'm going to take off this part and see how that looks. Still too tall. All right, so with the heights and relationship between the size of the trunk and the heights being sort of cleared up by those cuts, there were a couple of cuts that I didn't want to make, but it'll just get worse if I don't make them now. So I cut this one shorter, cut that one shorter to make it so that these two are the tallest, this one being taller than that one, and that's the relationship that your eye is really looking for in a forest composition. I'm going to go ahead and set this out on the bench to grow and mesh together. I might end up in a year or two actually bringing it up out of the pot a little bit the entire thing, so that I can create a little bit more undulation in the landscape like we saw when I was putting the clumps together. And that's about it. If you want to pick up some bare root Zelkova, you can find them at bonsaify.com. And thanks everyone for watching. We'll see you next time.